Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Clem Sunter, and today I'm going to talk to you about a book that was published by Penguin in July. It's called Thinking the Future. I wrote it with a young man called Mitch Ilbery, who is the daughter of a previous co-author of mine, Chantal Ilbery. We wrote a book in 2001 called The Mind of a Fox. But this book is more about the philosophy of thinking the future. And as you will see from the subtitle, it's New Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. And what we're doing is we're looking back in philosophy to all the people who contributed towards the methodology that we recommend in the book about thinking the future. I will then look at a couple of real-time futures that we are facing, one in the world at large and the other in South Africa, to show how the methodology works. We open this book with a chapter on two very well-known giants of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. Plato had this idea about the future and about the world around him, that if you thought carefully enough, you could come out of the cave, as he said, into the open light, and you could see the ideal forms of the world around you. So it was really a process of thinking that produced the truth for Plato. At the same time as Plato developed his philosophy, there was another famous Greek philosopher called Aristotle. And he had a completely different view to Plato. He thought that what we experience is for real. You don't have to try and think into an ideal world. What we see around us is real and objective. And he said, the real pursuit of knowledge is to look at all the things that are happening and to develop theories around them, and then to change your mind as you develop your theories because you see new things. And in other words, Aristotle was very much the founder of modern science and the way we go about trying to prove what is actually happening in the world at large. So you had these two theories being promoted by two very clever men in Greece, and for many centuries they were seen as alternatives to philosophy. In the 20th century, in 1960s, I was at Oxford University studying philosophy, and one of my lecturers was Isaiah Berlin, and he wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox, which became very popular in the UK at the time. And he quoted another ancient Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And he was trying to say that most people in this world are one or the other. They're idealists, and they have a single idea that drives them through life, and all their thinking goes around this one idea. And then you have foxes who are just like the animal. They look around them, they see what's happening, they have certain views, but as they experience more things, they change those views. And of course, the crucial difference in thinking the future is that hedgehogs bet big time on a single forecast of the future. And yes, they can either make a huge profit if they're proved correct, but they can also lose a lot if they're not. And foxes tend to look at futures in multiple scenarios and look at different possible futures and weigh them up. And then as the evidence come in, they change their minds. Now, it's quite interesting that after Chantal and I had introduced the idea again of hedgehogs and foxes in our book, The Mind of a Fox. There were two American authors who used this particular metaphor. The first one was Jim Collins in a book called Good to Great, where he advocated the hedgehog concept, where he said, you know, if you have one big idea which you're good at, then concentrate on it and develop your business around it, and you'll be successful. And he said foxes who tend to open up different parts of their business and in a sort of conglomerate type of way, pursue different interests, they're not as successful as those that focus on that single vision as hedgehogs. A second author in America called Philip Tetlock, who is probably one of America's top futurists, came out just a little bit later with some research where he said he'd studied 82,000 expert forecasts around America. And he said foxes think much more effectively about the future than hedgehogs. He said, you know, the problem with a lot of experts is they have a particular view of the world, like Plato advocated, and then their forecasts tend to be in line with that particular view. And more often than not, they're proved wrong. And he said it's those foxes who actually put forward a particular view of the future and then adjust it as experience comes in and attach probabilities to their forecast of how confident they are that they're right, that those kind of people capture the future much better than hedgehogs. And certainly we advocate in the book being a fox rather than a hedgehog, but we go further than Philip Tetlock. We don't feel you should just add probabilities to forecasts. What you should do is play different possible futures in terms of scenarios. And that is the best way to understand the pattern of the future and also the forces that are driving the present into the future. The second chapter we have in the book is all about Socrates, who was another ancient Greek philosopher, who basically said, whatever you assert and whatever you hear from other people, you have to question. You must never just assume the truth. You must put as much effort into looking at a proposition in a particular way, as well as the counter proposition, and then weigh up the two. And he actually died for this particular belief because he looked at things like justice in Athens and other basic concepts and challenged them. And the authorities didn't like this, so they put him on trial. And he was found guilty, and he had to drink hemlock, a poison. So he died for this belief that you must use the Socratic method when you make assertions about the future. And indeed, in that second chapter, we have what happened in the early part of the century when the CIA and MI6, the intelligence agencies in America and the UK, advised their leaders, George Bush and Tony Blair, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which was basically what the leaders had presumed. And in fact, it turned out to be totally incorrect. And there were commissions of inquiry as to why they had been advising the leaders this way, and they hadn't used the Socratic method and tested this intelligence properly. And it all comes down to one thing, that you tend to give confirmation bias to the people who are above you in your job or whatever it is that you do. And that is why it is so important to use the Socratic method when you're making any assertions about the future. The third chapter of the book is about Stoicism and Stoic philosophers. We know that most people think that Stoicism is about being resilient in the face of adversity. And yeah, that is certainly correct, but it's a much wider philosophy than that. It's all about understanding exactly what you control so that you can make an impact on what you don't control. In fact, in the book, we have the circle of what you control and then the much bigger circle of what you don't control. And you have to think of what you can do within your circle of control, not only to improve your own life, but also the lives of other people. And I'd like to just read you one of the philosophers who was a Stoic and what he said. He was called Epictetus. And more than 2,000 years ago, he said this: "The chief task in life is simply this, to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself what are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own." And so it was a much wider view that Stoics had, that you really want to get in life, you want to achieve true happiness, you must make that distinction between what you control and what you don't control, and then use what you control to make yourself a better life. And there is a kind of overlap between the two circles. And with social media, there are very clever people who manage to influence the world at large by using that sliver of overlap between these two circles. Look at Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish woman who has really captured the world's attention with climate change. And so she's had a major impact on that much bigger world by concentrating on what she can control in terms of her own behavior and what she says to the public at large. The fourth chapter is the real meat of the book. It's the methodology that we recommend that people use when they look at the future. And the giant of this chapter is a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, who studied under the American who invented scenario planning back in the early 60s. His name was Herman Kahn, and he wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, where he played a scenario of a full-scale conflict between the Soviet Union and America, and showed what incredible damage nuclear weapons could do to both countries as well as the rest of the world. And he called it scenario planning because he lived in California and he had several friends in Hollywood who were producers of movies. And the summary of a movie script is called a scenario. And you go around Hollywood raising money from financiers by showing them a scenario of the movie script. And he thought, that's what I'm doing with this book. I'm actually giving a movie script of how the future would look if we had a nuclear war. So he called it scenario and added the word planning because it was about the future. And that's how the whole methodology was born. And one of his first students was Pierre Wack, this Frenchman. And he studied under Herman, and then he went back to England and he introduced the methodology at Royal Dutch Shell, the oil company, during the 1970s. And one of the scenarios he wrote at the end of the 70s was a huge and sudden rise in the oil price. And it happened. It happened around about 76, 77. The price of oil went from $12 a barrel to $40 a barrel. And because Shell had been persuaded to accept the plausibility of this scenario and change their strategy, they made a lot of money, and Pierre became a legend in London. And it came to our attention as one of the biggest mining companies in the world. I worked for Anglo-American all my life, and our management in London said, if this man can do it for oil, maybe he can do it for gold and diamonds and all the other commodities that we produce. So we asked him to come to Johannesburg and give us a lecture at our head office in 44 Main Street. And yeah, he bewitched management. I was the secretary of the Anglo executive at the time. And I remember at the end of his presentation, Gavin Relly saying to me, if we hire Pierre as a consultant, would you be prepared to take on the function of scenario planning along with your normal mining responsibilities? And I said, absolutely, Gavin. And so I had this wonderful experience of working with Pierre for about 10 years. And we did the job. In the mid-1980s, we produced some scenarios on the global economy for the 1990s and then on South Africa. And as far as the global economy was concerned, we had one scenario. Remember, this is not a forecast. This was a kind of movie script of the future. And we called it Imperial Twilight. And it was the decline and disappearance of the Soviet Union because of being bankrupted by the arms race. And of course, it happened in 1990. The Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union disappeared. It wasn't so much because of the arms race, but because of Gorbachev, who wanted to renew Russia. But it happened, and we captured it in a scenario. But it was the South African scenarios that really grabbed people's attention in those days, because the methodology consists of 3 steps. You firstly look at the rules of the game, which apply to all scenarios, so that you don't write sort of too many scenarios. You try and restrict them within the rules of the game. And of course, it's the rules of the game that apply to the future, not the rules of the game that applied in the past. It's not like sport, like cricket or rugby or soccer, where you have rules which barely change over hundreds of years. The rules of real life, particularly in industry and for governments, they change much quicker. And so we came up with 2 rules of the game, which we felt would apply for all scenarios on the future of South Africa in the mid-1980s. The first rule of the game we called the equilibrium of violence. It was basically saying that the government at the time, the National Party government, had the weapons and the guns and all that kind of stuff, whereas the ANC had the numbers of people. And if there was a conflict between them, neither side would win. All you would do would increase that equilibrium of violence until it turned into a civil war. That was what we considered a rule of the game at the time. Nobody could win. And then the second rule of the game, we said, is that statutory apartheid must go in all its forms. There could be no compromise on that, because otherwise we would never return to the world. So there couldn't be any kind of in-between solutions to the future of South Africa. Statutory apartheid had to go completely. The next thing that Pierre said you should do after the rules of the game is look at the key uncertainties, which will drive the present into the future. And we basically had just one key uncertainty at the time, which was what is going to be the economic and political strategy of government ruling at the time, the National Party, and the ANC, because that would decide which scenario was going to be in play. Was it going to be one of compromise and negotiation, or was it going to be one of confrontation and conflict? And that produced two scenarios. The first one we called the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement. And the second was called the low road of civil war leading to a wasteland. And after we constructed these scenarios, I was asked to present them to all the employees around the mines that we had in South Africa. And then I went to the chairman and said, this has been so well received, do you mind if I make some public presentations? And a couple of other of my colleagues in Anglo and I went around the country giving these presentations. We gave it to the cabinet under F.W. de Klerk, but also the army and the police. And I certainly heard that the ANC listened to a video of the presentation in Lusaka. And the whole point was to say to people, you have a choice. You've got a choice between the high road and the low road. But you do not have a choice in terms of those rules of the game, which is nobody can win. In the case of a war, it just escalates that equilibrium of violence. And certainly to get back into the world, you've got to get rid of statutory apartheid. And yes, it changed the conversation because most people thought we were going to have a civil war at the time. But what comparing the high road to the low road did was it enriched the conversation. It made people contrast the two futures and allowed them to think, what is it within my circle of control that I can do in order to make the high road more probable? I actually, in 1990, went and saw Nelson Mandela in prison in January 1990, about a month before he was released, because he'd read about the high road, low road, and he wanted to ask me about the two scenarios. And yeah, he didn't tell me that he was about to be released, but it was a fascinating conversation with the man. And yeah, it gave me a good feeling about the future of South Africa. So that is the actual meat of the process that we're advocating in this book, that you've got to look at the rules of the game for your business or for your family or for your country. You've then got to think of the key driving forces, those uncertainties that can drive the future this way or that, and then you've got to write scenarios. The next chapter is on the one other thing you have to do, which is that you must give a probability to the scenarios as the future unfolds. And we base this on an Austrian British philosopher called Karl Popper, who produced this theory about clocks and clouds. He said you have two kinds of phenomena in the world. You have clocks, which are predictable because they tick away and you understand their internal mechanism. And you have clouds, where you do not know what the shape of that cloud is going to be in the next hour or in the next day. You simply don't know. And so life is a kind of spectrum from the highly uncertain to the very certain. And we thought that's a very good way of putting forward the one other thing you should do with scenario planning, which is think of a few flags that would tell you whether the scenario is coming into play or not. Are they green flags or are they red flags? And so it's a very vital final step in our process that we're advocating in our fourth chapter, that for each scenario, you should think what would be the indications that this scenario is coming into play. And certainly, when I went and saw Nelson Mandela in January 1990, that was a small green flag. But of course, when he was released in February, that became a very positive flag that perhaps we could have a negotiated settlement to South Africa. The next chapter of the book is about a Scottish philosopher called David Hume. And he said one thing back in the 1700s. He said, reason is the slave of passion. And that is so true, that we tend, when we look at the future or we look at anything, we look at it through a veil of our emotion, and we are influenced by our emotion. So people like to think of desirable futures. Al Gore, who was one of the first big names on climate change, called it an inconvenient truth, because he wanted to show people that we don't confront things like climate change because they are inconvenient truths. And it's such a good way of describing what scenarios are supposed to do, because by using the Socratic method of testing every assumption by questioning it and looking at different possible futures, you are trying to pierce that veil of emotion which you have when you look at the future. And the flags are there as kind of pins to prick that bubble around you, to say, gosh, you know, the future is beginning to go this way, even if it's the way that you do not want that future to happen. And yeah, he also said, David Hume, that reason is the slave of passion, but it should be. And the reason he said it should be is that we are propelled by our emotions to do things rather than by our reason and logic. We can analyze everything till the cows come home, but that doesn't encourage us into action. It's our imagination and emotion that makes us act. And that's one of the reasons that scenario planning is so much better than forecasting, because, you know, it really doesn't mean anything to say, I predict this will happen with a particular probability. Nobody's going to be urged into action by that kind of statement. But if you say, here's the bad scenario for the future, here's the good scenario, what are you going to do to make the good one happen and steer away from the bad one? That gets people emotionally involved in the process. So David Hume talked about the complexity of human nature and how you had to understand that we look at the things around us through this veil of emotion. We must be aware of it so we don't allow it to cloud our judgment. The next chapter in the book is about Charles Darwin, that eminent biologist who wrote The Origin of the Species. And one of the things he talked about was survival of the fittest. And everybody thinks that when he said that, he was saying that the species that survive are the most powerful species. But he didn't mean that. He was saying that the species who survive are those who fit in to the changes in nature around them. So it absolutely squares with our point about foxes. Foxes are adaptable. They're looking around them. They have sharp eyes. They adapt their behavior very quickly. And was what Darwin was really trying to get across, that if you want to, you know, continue past all your competitors, you've got to adapt to that circle which is beyond your control and which is changing all the time. So it's an incredibly important point that he was making. But it's not just adaptation that makes you successful. It's also innovation. I mean, we have this incredible faculty where we can dream about completely new things. I mean, most people at the beginning of this pandemic would have said it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. But actually, there were a few people in this world, including a couple of Turkish origin who lived in Germany, who actually came up with a completely new type of vaccine within 12 months. It was absolutely brilliant. And that's the other faculty we have. And so the whole chapter is about how you have to have both the ability to adapt and the ability to innovate if you really want to be successful as you move forward. Which brings me to probably one of the most important chapters in the book, which is called The Ethical Compass. And we called it that because so many people, when they're thinking of what they can do in the future, say, what's the law? And we draw a sharp distinction between what is legal and illegal and what is ethical and unethical. There's a huge argument in the UK at the moment around MPs in the House of Commons having second jobs, which earn them a lot of extra money. And it may be legal, but in the eyes of the public, it's seen as wrong for people not to be concentrating on, the most important thing, which is to represent their constituents rather than make additional money by other jobs. And big tech at the moment, companies like Facebook and Apple and Twitter and others have been put under a huge amount of pressure because people are questioning some of their practices, not so much from a legal point of view, but whether it's ethical or whether it is a fundamental invasion of privacy or whatever. And so what we're saying is that when you do all that work of looking at the rules of the game, the key uncertainties, the scenarios, and then you're looking at the flags, you've got to do all of that within an ethical compass. Which then brings us to the last two chapters of the book. The second last chapter is called Thinking and Doing. And we're making the point that if you really want to have a successful life, you can't just think about the future, you've got to do it. And we have two giants in this chapter. The first is Nelson Mandela, who, as I said, I met just before he was released. And he showed that, when he got out of prison, he went and did it. He sat down with de Klerk, they negotiated, and then there was a much wider negotiation. And when talks fell down, it was Mandela, together with de Klerk, who resuscitated the talks. And he did it in the sense that, we did have a proper democratic election. We got rid of statutory apartheid, and we got back into the world. And the other giant that we have in this chapter is Steve Jobs, because he did it with Apple. And he did it in two phases. One of the incredible things about Steve Jobs is people forget that he founded Apple, produced the Apple I and Apple II. Then he had a row with the CEO of Apple at the time, and he quit in the 80s. And then he came back in the 1990s, and that's when his creative period really started. He was at Pixar and Next for many years. And I want to read you one thing that he said. He said, "The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure of everything." That was when he came back to Apple for the second time. "It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." And that's when he came up with the iPad, the iPod, the iPhone, all the things that we take for granted now as the devices that have changed our lives. But the most important thing, he said, was you've got to be a thinker-doer. And he did precisely that. He called it making a ding in the universe. You don't make a ding in the universe if you're just thinking about the future. You've then got to basically act after you've done the thinking. And then the last chapter of the book is about our own future. We call it Planting Seeds. And it's about the future of education, because who has the longest future in the world are our young people who are going to school. And we feel very strongly that the education system is still locked in the last century. It's not reflecting the huge changes in the rules of the game that we now have in this century. Let me give you one example. Work has completely changed. In the last century, big companies were responsible for most of the jobs, creating most of the jobs in the world. But then along came artificial intelligence, automation, and many other innovations. And suddenly, big business was no longer creating all those hundreds of thousands of jobs. And nowadays, the biggest job creator is small business. And so we have got to teach all the children in the world how to create jobs for themselves, rather than get a job by waving a CV of your matric results or university degree in front of a potential employer. It's so different, the job market today. And we wanted to end the book in a way that showed that the most important people to get this message across to about how you should think the future are the people who are educating the children of the future. So what are the two examples that we quote in the book using this particular technique? The first one is about climate change, and it was very appropriate that we put this in the book, because right now you have this COP26 conference going on in Glasgow, and it will become history, but there's going to be a lot of discussion coming out of the conference. And we put forward 4 scenarios for the future of our planet. But before we did that, we had certain rules of the game. And the most important rule of the game for us is that you have to have universal cooperation on this particular issue in a way that we've never had to before in the world's history. I mean, you think back of all the conflicts and all the wars and one nation invading another nation's territory. Unfortunately, humankind has had this terrible history of conflict. And now we've got to put that on one side, because if we don't put it on one side, we will all be defeated because we will not have a planet. And the second rule of the game is that there is no planet B. We can't, as a species, fly off conveniently to another planet. It's too far away. Even if it exists, it is just too far away. And so it is a massive rule of the game that right now we need to do something that we've never done before, which is we've got to cooperate towards a common objective, which is getting rid of climate change, the warming of the world being restricted to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. We've got to do these kind of things, and we can only do it as a team. The second or third rule of the game is that we must actually have the rich countries helping the poor countries, because make no mistake, this is going to take a lot of effort and a lot of money to move away from fossil fuels. And it just means that we're going to have to see a lot more generosity in the world than we have at the moment. The key uncertainties we have two, which is, what is the level of cooperation going to be, particularly between China and America, the two biggest carbon emitters, because they are so different. I mean, I've done scenario planning lectures at Harvard Business School in Boston, in America. And I've also done a presentation at the Central Party School in Beijing, in China, which is the leadership academy for the Communist Party. And I can't tell you how different the cultures of the two nations are. Americans are democratic and independent, whereas Chinese are autocratic and more collectivist. They do things in groups. And I don't know, given these two very different cultures, whether they're going to cooperate enough on solving this problem and create a sort of joint leadership to lead all the other nations in the world towards resolving this problem. So that's a key uncertainty. And then the other key uncertainty is around whether we're going to create that condition of unity in the world, which is required, because there are so many other issues as well. Even though climate is the dominant issue, there's so many other things going on at the same time. So are we going to go forward in a state of unity, or are we going to go forward in the usual state of conflict? And that basically gives you four possible scenarios. The first one is where we get a sufficient degree of unity, particularly with America and China leading the way, and we have real green commitment in terms of new targets being set by COP26 and nations being measured on whether they achieve those targets. And we call that paradise regained. That's what we call the scenarios. It was a poem by John Milton. And we may hopefully get back to the kind of richness of the world that we deserve as a species, and particularly our children and grandchildren. The second scenario is where you do have a level of unity, but it's all political rhetoric. As Greta Thunberg herself said, blah, blah, blah. And actually, it just doesn't work. And we call that paradise lost because, yes, pledges are made, but nothing really gets done. Nobody says, this is exactly what we have to do in order to move away from fossil fuels. And indeed, we say one of the big gaps in this conference is we haven't had the kind of scenario, a detailed narrative, a detailed movie script of what it really means to move away from fossil fuels. How is that energy going to be provided? How are we going to transport ourselves in future? What new technologies are going to come to our rescue? We haven't seen that detail yet. But there are two other scenarios where if the world is disunited and continues to sort of wage war on each other, then you have, number one, a scenario which we call isolated Edens. It's where you get some countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, trying to create little Edens inside their countries. But it doesn't work in the long run because we have one atmosphere. And if there are other countries that are messing up that atmosphere, it basically affects the future of everybody. But at least there are some countries trying to preserve a kind of Eden quality to their existence. And then the last scenario is the one we have to avoid. It's called Pandemonium. It's where we descend into total chaos because you have 8 billion human beings in this world and half the world becoming uninhabitable. And you have all those human beings trying to get into other countries that you can live in. And you think that the kind of illegal immigration problem is bad enough as it is. It's nothing compared to what would happen in a pandemonium scenario, where people have to collectively move out of a particular country because there is nothing left. It's either very harsh drought or sea levels have risen so that it's destroyed a lot of the land. And it could be coastal cities are also will disappear. And where will all those people from the coastal cities go? So it is a very, very dramatic scenario, that of pandemonium. And then we say the flags to watch. One of the biggest flags to watch now will be whether America and China actually get it together in terms of leading the rest of the world, or whether they don't. Another flag is the actual rate of change in temperatures and the frequency of extreme weather events, because even the scientists don't know. They will tell you that the one thing they were all wrong about was the fact that this would only happen at the end of the century, and it's happening right now. Their models did not allow for how quick this change would come. And they're saying one of the critical flags to watch now is whatever we do, how fast are we actually warming the planet? And what are the kind of weather patterns saying to us about the future? So it is a tough set of scenarios that we've got them in the book. We think that is the only way to discuss what we're going to do, because it's the way you motivate people to do things. Getting back to David Hume, you've got to say, what is it you're going to do to reduce your own carbon footprint in order to avoid the pandemonium scenario? That's much better than saying there's a 20% probability to the world warming up by 3 degrees in the next 50 years. That doesn't stimulate people, but playing these different scenarios does. And the second set we do is on South Africa. And I just want to read you the rule of the game that we have for South Africa at the moment. We say South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The treasury is virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We are at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And then we offer 2 scenarios to people here. The first one we call People's Economy, to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others constitutes unfinished business. In this sequel, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. The government creates an inclusive economy with a new generation of young entrepreneurs at the helm. And the second scenario we call Cautionary Tale. Here, South Africa experiences rising popular anger caused by an economy that is stagnant, exclusive, and cursed by a dismally high unemployment rate. This leads to further disunity and widespread violence, with a possible endpoint of total anarchy in the chain of causation. And we got a kind of whiff of the cautionary tale about a month after this book was published in July, with those terrible riots which destroyed shopping malls in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. And that really showed people, what can happen if you're not actually creating this people's economy. I have to say that the community pushback to those riots showed the other side of South Africa. Firstly, the protection of all the property that wasn't damaged, and then the cleanup operation which was undertaken for damaged property. This was something that the communities did. It was done on the ground, And it showed the best of South Africa, that we can work as a team at a time in crisis. And so those are the two scenarios. And probably the biggest flag, which will tell us whether we're moving towards the people's economy, is that if Cyril sets up a panel of entrepreneurial experts on the recovery of the South African economy, just like right now he's got a panel of medical experts to advise the government on how to steer its way through the coronavirus pandemic and find the right balance between lives and livelihoods. He does that, and he goes regularly on TV to announce where we are and what the new measures are. Well, we need to do exactly that again, but in terms of the recovery of our economy. Because I go back to that point about work, is we are only going to create millions of jobs if we create millions of new businesses and we empower our entrepreneurs. I did a debate in February 2016 with Julius Malema. It was at the Cape Sun in the evening, and it was sponsored by the Cape Chamber of Commerce. And during the debate, I said, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to take over the banks and the mines, expropriate the land. I want to create genuine economic freedom for the future entrepreneurs of South Africa, because that is what will determine whether we become a winning nation or not. I mean, look at America. Why is it the #1 economy in the world? It's partially to do with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and the great political leaders like that. But most of all, it's to do with the people who came up with new ideas. Henry Ford with the first mass automation production of cars. He was the first guy that came up with the kind of cheap car. Then you had Walt Disney with cartoons. And then in last century, Bill Gates with computer operating systems. And then you've had Steve Jobs. It's having those people with those wonderful ideas, and then managing to create businesses that go worldwide. And we need that. And we need some of the people who've done that on our panel advising Cyril. I mean, Adrian Gore, who founded Discovery, he would be a very good person for that panel. Even Elon Musk with Tesla, who's now the richest man in the world, and he went to Pretoria Boys High. He maybe should be on that panel too. But we need that kind of entrepreneurial surge in South Africa. And another flag to watch is whether big business is going to dedicate part of its supply chain to helping new entrepreneurs to establish themselves. We'll need stock exchanges in all our major cities so that small businesses can put themselves on those websites and raise money through crowdfunding. And also we need a micro lending scheme like they have in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank, where maybe all our major banks get together and come out with a scheme where entrepreneurs in rural and urban areas can raise money fairly easily for their new businesses. Those are the kind of flags which will tell you that we're on the road to creating a people's economy. But we also need Cyril to lead from the front by going on TV and saying where we are, these are our objectives, this is what we've done, and this is the next measurable goal that we've got to achieve. We need all of that in order to create this type of economy. So that is the second set of scenarios we have in the book. I hope I've entertained you. I hope that I've given you a real feel for being a fox as opposed to a hedgehog and looking at the future, using the technique that I've described about the rules of the game, then looking at the key uncertainties, and finally coming up with different scenarios which you weigh up in your mind, and then looking at the flags which will tell you whether you're moving towards the good scenario and the bad scenario. That is what will really motivate you to do things that change your future. And I'd like to end up with a benediction for all of you in the audience who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.